Hi there. Deciding where to apply for clinical psychology training is one of the most important decisions that you'll ever make because you'll spend 3 of the most formative years of your life there. Often people don't give the decision as much thought as they should. In the UK there are 32 different universities offering clinical psychology training, and there are lots of differences. In this video I'm not going to tell you where the best place to apply to is. That will be different for different people. But I will explain the important factors to look at and the questions to ask. This is an updated version of the video I published in October 2024, and now I've incorporated the 2025 data from the Clearinghouse and the information from the 25-26 Alternative Handbook that's just been published. I wanted to get this update out as quickly as possible, so I haven't updated all of the video clips. I did put on the same jumper, so trying to not make the changes too annoying. But all the graphs I have updated. I've also tried to make the video as concise as possible, as I know you're all very busy people, especially at this time of year. So I've cut out the introduction that I had in the last video. You can read about me on the YouTube channel if you're interested. But what I do have to say is that although all of the information I'm presenting is based on independent published data, any opinions expressed are mine alone and in no way reflect any of the universities or bodies that I've previously or currently been associated with. Anyway, I do hope you find this updated video helpful. Okay, before we get into the differences between courses, I think it's important to just emphasise that there are a lot of similarities between clinical psychology courses in the UK, and there's a number of reasons for this. The first is that all of the programmes in the UK are approved by the Health and Care Professions Council, which has standards of proficiency which it requires all programmes to ensure trainees come out with. All programmes are also accredited by the British Psychological Society, which has standards for training. And also all courses in the UK have the same customer, that's the National Health Service. Now some courses do have self-funding or places for international students, but all courses in the UK are funded by the NHS, and therefore they're shaped by what the NHS needs in terms of its workforce. So although there are some differences, all courses in the UK have the same basic components, and that includes focusing on at least 2 models, evidence-based models of psychological therapy, one of which is cognitive behaviour therapy. So although courses differ in terms of their emphasis, they do have quite a lot of similarities. The first and most obvious difference between courses is where they are. There's 32 different clinical psychology programs in the UK, including 2 in Scotland, 2 in Wales and 1 in Northern Ireland. The first thing to consider is obviously where the course is based. Now, obviously, if you're based in a particular part of the country and for whatever reason have limited ability to travel, then this is going to be a major factor in your decision making. People, when they think about location, tend to focus, I think, on the location of the university, where the teaching and the staff teaching happens, and where the staff are based. However, as we'll come on to talk about later, actually, as a trainee, you'll be spending at least half your time on placement. So at least as important, probably more important, because you're not in teaching all of the time on the non-placement days. Is where the placements are, but the first thing to think about is where the program is based. The second thing to think about are the entry criteria. These do vary by program, so you definitely need to make sure you're clear about these, as you don't want to waste one of your choices on somewhere where you don't meet the minimum criteria. I'm not going to try and list all of the criteria for each course here, because that information is quite clearly laid out on the Clearinghouse website. All courses, however, require a qualification in psychology that's accredited by the British Psychological Society, and that can either be an undergraduate degree or a postgraduate conversion course. All courses also require home fee status for NHS funded places. However, there are some significant differences between courses, and these are mainly in relation to academic grade requirements and the requirements for previous experience. Okay, so in terms of relevant experience, most courses say that this should involve working with clinical populations. A few specify that it should be with more than one different population. Generally, this experience can be either paid or voluntary work, although a few courses do specify that all or part of it has to be paid work. In terms of the amount the minimum amount required, the majority of courses specify a minimum of 1 year full-time equivalent at the time of application. A small number of courses require 18 months or 2 years. The clearinghouse system automatically works out the number of full-time equivalent months you've done in a post, and it takes it from the date of the application close. So regardless of when you apply, everyone is considered equally. Most courses don't count your experience before the end of your undergraduate degree, but a small number either say they don't specify any minimum requirement or that they do consider undergraduate experience. So again, definitely you need to check that you have the minimum level of experience that's specified by a course that you're considering applying for. But I would say I wouldn't read too much into it beyond that, because the alternative handbook asks current trainees how much experience they actually had, and you'll see that for most courses, trainees have at least a couple of years experience, even for courses where they don't have stated minimum experience requirements. So this graph is one of many that's based on the data in the alternative handbook published by the BPS, which I'll give a link to at the end and in the description. Here I've worked out the average number of years experienced trainees on each course said they had before they started. You can see that here Hull is an outlier, with trainees on average having fewer years of experience. That's because this is the one direct entry programme, so it makes sense that that's an outlier. But if you look at all the others, there actually isn't that much difference between the averages for all the courses. They vary from about 3.5 years to 6 years, and of course these are averages, so there will be a range within each course. Okay, so firstly, in terms of the academic grade requirements, the vast majority of courses say they will only consider applicants who have either a 2:1 or a first class degree or its equivalent in a psychology postgraduate conversion. A few courses also say they will only consider an applicant if their overall mark is in their undergraduate degree or conversion is 65 or above, i.e. high 2:1. And one course actually specifies 67 or above. On the other hand, some courses say that they will consider applicants below their academic grade cutoffs if they meet some other criteria, and that's typically a distinction in a master's or a PhD. Although beware, because some of these courses specify only a research master's as opposed to a taught master's degree. No course currently has requirements for A-level grades, although some do consider A-level grades in their selection process, misguidedly in my humble opinion. The alternative handbook asks current trainees to say what grade they got in their undergraduate degree. The data shows that you definitely don't have to have a first-class degree to get into clinical psychology training, as is sometimes suggested. However, it's also clear that some programs weight academic attainment much more highly than others do. Okay, so here I've plotted the proportion of current trainees who have first-class undergraduate degrees, and as you can see, it varies quite massively across different courses. The courses at the far end, not surprisingly, are the same ones who say that they rank academic attainment as the first stage of their shortlisting process. So basically they are then only selecting from a pool of applicants who have higher degree grades. I won't go off on too much of a bender about this, but just in case anyone watching is interested, I've always argued that we should include undergraduate attainment in shortlisting. Everyone who applies has already spent time at university studying psychology, so it'd be crazy if we didn't take their past performance into account. However, that should be at the same time as we look at all the other dimensions, and ideally be contextualized. Ranking based on academic grades before looking at anything else distorts who comes into the profession. Anyway, rant over. It's certainly, as an applicant, worth being aware of the relative weight courses place on academic grades, the ones you're interested in. So far we've mentioned two main criteria: where the course is and what the entry requirements are. And in my experience, sometimes people don't look any further than this. Just where can I go to the course and will they let me in? But there are some there are some important differences between programs that are definitely worth considering. And the first of these that I'll talk about is cohort size, as this definitely does differ quite substantially between courses within the UK. The first of these differences is the size of the cohort, the class size, which, as you can see from this graph showing the 2025 intake, varies quite dramatically across different universities. In 2025, the median size was 38, but the smallest courses were less than half of that, whereas UCL at the other extreme is up at 85. Cohort size in itself does affect the trainee experience. Not necessarily better or worse to have a larger or smaller cohort size, but being one of a cohort of 14 is going to be a very different training experience to being one of a cohort of 85. Smaller cohorts do tend to be much more tightly bonded and regularly go out together socially, whereas you could easily go the whole 3 years without speaking to someone on a large cohort. On the other hand, with a big cohort, there's a greater chance that there'll be someone within the group who shares your specific interests or characteristics, and that might be particularly important if you identify as a member of a minority group. Just as cohort size varies widely, the number of applications a course receives also varies, although not in exactly the same way. Last year, Bangor received only just over 200 applications, whereas the Royal Holloway received more than 7 times that number. Holloway does have a lot more places, but only 4 times as many, rather than 7 times as many. The numbers applying to each course do vary a bit from year to year, so I would caution against putting too much weight on any individual year. However, if you look at the average over a period of time, say, as I've done here, 3 years, there are programs that receive consistently greater or fewer numbers of applications per place than average. Now, this is only one bit of information, and you certainly wouldn't want to base your decision just on this one aspect, but I do think it's important to consider. So if, for example, you found that all 4 of your sort of top choices were well above average in terms of their number of applications per place, you might well want to think about picking one choice that was relatively less competitive to improve your overall chances. Now, of course, there might be a reason why a particular course receives fewer than average applications, so you don't want to use this in isolation from other sources of information. But if you look at Teesside, for example, on the graph here, I know from the satisfaction data that we'll talk about in a bit, that this course had the highest overall trainee satisfaction rating over the past 5 years. And it's also well below the average in terms of numbers of applications per place. So if that was geographically an option for you, that might well factor into your decision. Another way that courses differ is in terms of their selection procedures. Now, all courses carry out individual interviews, but almost all do so with a ratio of about 3 interviews per place that they have on the programme, which means that most applications are screened out at the shortlisting stage. Now, how programmes manage that stage, it does vary, Most courses base their shortlisting decisions on the application form and traditionally have two people rating each individual form. Whereas a small number of courses conduct online testing and base their decision wholly or partly on online testing. Sometimes they use the form, but certainly one course makes it clear that they don't use the application form at all at the shortlisting stage. I've personally written and spoken about the potential adverse effect of shortlisting tests on diversity, but I won't go into that here. For you as an individual applicant, the decision is really which you think most suits you. Some people feel quite confident about reasoning tests, other people really hate them. So it's definitely worth looking at the process that's involved for any courses that you're considering. At the risk of this turning into a feature film, I'm going to scoot through the next few differences between courses. Sometimes people do spend quite a lot of time worrying about this, the course orientation and balance of models. There's a degree of difference between courses, but I would say it's only a degree. As I mentioned at the beginning, the courses have the same basic core components, and all courses will have people who are specialists in the particular areas coming in to teach on particular therapy models, and that will be their passion. So personally, I wouldn't base too much on that particular issue. Courses vary a bit in terms of their accreditations, that they have secondary accreditations. So courses sometimes have accreditation for CBT from the BABCP. Some courses have accreditation for systemic family therapy from the Association of Family Therapy, and some courses have a pathway by which experience and teaching can be counted against the requirements of a postdoctoral qualification in clinical neuropsychology. I would say some of these things are pathways that apply to, or mostly these pathways apply to a minority of trainees. So not all trainees would do a particular pathway. In fact, you'd be pretty overwhelmed if you tried to do all the pathways. So if it's something that's particularly important to you, then it's definitely worth looking into that. Although I would stress that all of these things are possible to do once you finish training, even if you haven't had the pathway during training. So again, I wouldn't necessarily panic about this and think that you have to do this during your clinical psychology training. The other thing that courses do vary, and again, I think people tend, perhaps this isn't so obvious, courses vary a bit in terms of how they carry out assessments during the 3 years, and that can have a bit of an impact on your experience as trainees. Some courses have written exams at different points, sometimes just in the first year, sometimes throughout, whereas other courses don't have any written exams at all. A few courses have OSCEs, which are kind of structured clinical assessments, which are sort of taken from, used quite widely in medical schools. So it's again worth just looking at the kinds of assessments that different programs have, and also the number of assessments. And this will also tie into what I was just mentioning about pathways, because often when there's a secondary accreditation, it invariably does involve more assessments, unless you can combine some of them, but typically that requires some additional assessments. So it's worth just looking at the number of assessments across the program, and how many you would do if you were going into a pathway. And again, the alternative handbook comments in there will often refer to the number of assessments, and also how assessments are spaced out. Sometimes if you look at the alternative handbook, you'll see people talking about how heavy the workload is in terms of the number of assessments in a particular time. So it's worth considering that if you're comparing programs. Anyway, I did say I was going to keep going and not make this into a feature film. Okay, I'm going to try and do this one quickly as well. People often think about the teaching component of the program. As I mentioned, often people think about where the university is based, which is where the teaching is often going to be located, and that is worth thinking about. Although, as I'll come on to tell you when we talk about placements, teaching is only one component of a program, and actually a relatively smaller component. But it's worth thinking about obviously where the teaching is, and also the facilities that are around the course base: library facilities, facilities for trainees in terms of common room space, study space, etc. And also teaching does vary across programs in terms of how it's organised. So some programs have blocks of teaching where trainees are in teaching 5 days a week for a sort of few weeks, and then on placement all of the time, whereas other programs have a pattern whereby trainees come in for teaching 1 or 2 days a week, and typically teaching is kind of front loaded into the first part of the first year and first 18 months of the program, but that varies a bit between programs as well, just in terms of how the teaching is organised across the 3 years. It's worth looking at that. The other component of clinical psychology training is research, and research varies a bit across programs as well. The opportunities for research will be sort of related to the research that's going on in that particular setting, and locally within the NHS. So if you've got particular interest in research and a particular area of research, that might influence your choice of program. Orientation in terms of research methods, that varies a little bit between programs. Some programs have more of a focus and sort of expertise in qualitative research, others more of a focus and more of expertise in quantitative research, and indeed some programs, a minority of programs, would have some restrictions in terms of the sort of choice you have over the nature of the research you do. So some programs would sort of you'd be restricted to choosing a project that was linked to something that was going on in the department or school at the present time, or other programs would be less restrictive, and you'd be very much have free rein to sort of go with your own idea, although that sounds appealing, but just bear in mind that you're going to need to find someone who's willing and able to supervise you. So even if a program says you've got free rein, there's going to be a limitation in terms of being able to find a supervisor anyway. But that does vary in terms of how restrictive programs are to start with, in terms of what kind of research you can do. The last aspect I'm going to talk about, but by no means the least, is the location and range of clinical placements. And this is really important because the BPS accreditation requirements specify that trainees must spend at least 50% of their time on clinical placement. So you will actually be spending a lot more time as a trainee out on placement than you will be in the university. So as I mentioned, there's 32 clinical psychology courses across the UK, and they are spread right across the United Kingdom. The population, however, is not spread evenly across the UK. As you can see from the graph here, the map here, population density map, population is quite sort of concentrated in particular areas. So population is concentrated in London, in the Midlands, around Birmingham, around the northwest, around Liverpool and Manchester, and other areas of the country, population spread much more thinly. So by sort of deduction, you can assume that clinical services will be spread out more geographically widely in those areas of the country. So that does make an impact on the training experience. So services are going to be more close together in urban areas, and travelling to see patients in their own home is going to involve shorter distances than it will do in more rural areas. What I suggest you do is to look at the course information, and particularly the description of the placement area, and just look at that on a map to see what it looks like. I've done a few examples here just to illustrate. So if we look at the Bangor programme, this is the description of the placement area for the Bangor programme, and looking at it on a map, that's the area that it encompasses. Compare that to the Manchester programme, which says most of the placements are within Greater Manchester, which is a relatively quite a sort of restricted geographical area, although some placements might be further away. If you look at the Staffordshire programme, the description is that the placements might be across the whole of Staffordshire and Shropshire, which is quite a large geographical area. Oxford placements in Oxford on the Oxford programme are across Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire, which is actually quite a large area. And if you were to go back to the population density map, you would see that you've got sort of small areas of dense population in Reading and Oxford, but other than that, it's actually quite sparsely populated, that area. The IOPPN, on the other hand, is much more densely populated, and the description there is that the majority of placements are located within not just London, but within South London, and are accessible via public transport, because of course the other thing that varies here is the provision of public transport. So in a programme in an urban area, you're going to be able to use public transport a lot more than you are in a rural area. Although it's important to state here that all programmes will take account of disability. So if you have a disability that affects your mobility, then that is definitely something that all programmes will take into account and have a priority to locate you as close to your home as possible. So I think bear that in mind. But other than that, I think it's clear that the distances travelled are going to vary. And just the last one I've mapped out is Plymouth, where the placements are across Cornwall, Plymouth and South Devon. The alternative handbook asks trainees to report how long they spend travelling to and from clinical placement. I've simplified this in this graph by plotting the percentage of trainees who reported travelling more than 1 hour each way. You might be quite surprised to see that the London courses are actually quite far down this graph. That's probably to do with the price of accommodation, meaning that even though the placements might be near the university base, trainees themselves are actually having to live further out. Placement travel, however, in the urban areas in the north of England is lower, as you might expect based on the population density. You might be surprised to see that Plymouth is actually in number 2 place for the shortest placement commute. That actually brings us to an important issue. As I mentioned earlier, the placement area of the Plymouth programme is actually very large, but trainees are allocated to a smaller subsection of this for the duration of their training. Which means they can base themselves within that area and thereby not have to commute so far to their placements. That's similar to the Scottish courses, where trainees are allocated to a regional health board. Now, of course, the flip side of this is that if you are allocated to an area that's quite a long way from the university base, you might have short distances to placement, but you're going to have a long distance to travel to teaching. However, if your placement base is considered your work base, which it usually would be, then at least you can claim travel expenses for that journey. And also, in the case of Plymouth, which I know from having worked on the programme, trainees are reimbursed the price of hotel accommodation if they have to travel over a certain distance to attend teaching. So it's definitely worth looking not just at what the overall area of placements are, but how trainees are allocated and whether they're allocated to specific smaller areas for the duration of the programme. Okay, so we've been through talking about the range of different factors to consider when comparing programs and the ways in which programs differ. The last thing I want to say is that I think you should also definitely listen to the experts, and the experts in terms of the experience of being on a training program are definitely not the staff but the trainees, and the BPS does a great job every year in collecting a huge amount of information from trainees on their experience, and it's definitely worth looking through that, and it's presented in quite an accessible form online now, as you'll know, in the alternative handbook. The amount of information can be a little bit overwhelming, and some years ago the BPS brought in a sort of single friends and family type question about recommending would you recommend this program to others, and I was one of the people that really pushed for that, because it's a way of just having one indication of overall satisfaction with the program that you can use to compare programs. And again, I wouldn't put too much weight on this for one individual year. It does vary. It tends to go up and down a bit each individual year. But if you look over an average over a period, again, here I've done 3 years, you do find that there are consistent differences between programs in terms of overall satisfaction. So if I just show you, this is the average for the last 3 years. So the surveys that were carried out in 2022, 23 and 24. And you can see that there's quite a significant difference between the courses at the top, where over 90% of current trainees are saying that they would recommend their course to others, compared to those at the bottom, where less than half of trainees are saying that they would recommend the course to others. Now, again, I wouldn't just take that purely at face value, but I would look at, I'd certainly look in more detail at the alternative handbook and look at what trainees are saying about sources of dissatisfaction, and consider how that might affect you personally. There are different kind of aspects of courses that trainees might be finding difficult, and you might want to think about how that affects you, how might that affect you personally. I would also say it's worth looking not just at the average, but also look at the trajectory. So I'll just show you that on the next page. As I've said, the 3-year average data is much more reliable than looking at any single year, because the sample size for a given course is often quite low, much lower than you'd want for reliability. However, you will also want to look at the trends. Some courses are consistently higher than average, others are gradually going up, whereas some are consistently low. I've done 5-year trend graph for all 32 courses, and I've put a link to access them in the description on YouTube. One that really stands out this year is Coventry, which has previously been consistently high but dropped massively in the 2025 survey, and in fact scored the lowest level recorded since that question, the friends and family question, was first included several years ago. In this case, the comments of the trainees are quite consistent between them in referring to recent staff reductions. So if you're interested in that particular programme, that's certainly something to check on. So there are lots of other sources of information for you to look at. Almost all the data I've presented in this video has come either from the Clearinghouse for postgraduate courses in clinical psychology, or the BPS Alternative Handbook. And I'll put the links for those. If you don't, you probably know them, but if you don't, I'll put the links in the description for you to access that directly. And in addition to those resources, there's a couple of other things here. Links again I'll put in the description to the BPS pre-qualification group, Division of Clinical Psychology pre-qualification group, which is a really helpful community. Applying for ClinPsych programs can be a stressful business, and to cope with stress, there's nothing better than being in a community of people who are going through the same thing and supporting each other. So I would encourage you to engage in that. If you identify as a member of a minoritized group, the DCP minorities group is another excellent community to support people going through the process, although it's now across the whole of the DCP. And also the Facebook group is another excellent source of support, of information, and I sort of comment and try and provide some sort of responses on that, but I know there's lots of people providing really helpful support on that. And also Miriam Silver's website, ClinSci Forum, can be really helpful as well. So there are lots of other sources of information around there. You're not doing this on your own. Okay, so that's it. We've come to the end of the video. I fear that even though I have tried to cut down this updated version, it might actually have turned out to be longer than the original, but there is a lot of information around, so I've tried my best to sort of squash it down and summarize it here for you. But don't let all the information put you off. But do think about the differences between courses and think about which one might be the best one for you, the best fit for you. So good luck, you've got this, and I hope this video really helps you make an informed decision that's the right decision for you. So I wish you all the best.